We have our final speaker today, Jay Zarnetske. He's an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, where he studies watershed science and helps train the next generation of environmental scientists. In order to answer a wide range of fundamental and applied scientific questions, he focuses on questions about the physics and chemistry of water, such as where does water go when it rains? Hopefully not in my basement. What flow path does it take, and how long will it take to get there? Working with scientists and policymakers around the world, Dr. Zarnetske has been part of research projects done on every continent, generating more than 60 publications and dozens of educational and outreach products. He recently led an international team that changed the way the global water cycle is depicted and taught around the world, leading Arctic research expeditions, and was head of the major, I think still are, of the major non-profit organization providing critical data and computing infrastructure for water scientists around the world. And when we had the president visit recently, he convinced the president to take another look at the water cycle on our planet. So that was a very good thing to do. So please join me in welcoming Jay to the stage.
Okay, I'm excited to be here. I've watched these presentations online in the past, and I'm really excited to be able to talk to you some about the work that I really care a lot about. I know MSU really cares about, and I hope to convince you to care a lot about it in the future. I also will point out that I am not Italian, nor have I ever lived in Rome. So I wanted to bring a little different perspective, both to my background and to the style of talk that I want to give you today. And hopefully by the end of my talk, you'll see why I'm mixing it up from the more traditional way that we present science. You'll get some of that, don't worry, but also talking more about how we tell our stories. So, so let's get started. If I can get... All right, I will use this. Here we go. Or not. It's not advancing. Thank you. Now, if I was an undergrad scholar at this point, I might be a little frazzled about the technological difficulties, but I've been lecturing long enough to know that this stuff happens, and hopefully we can all get back going here. All right, so a photograph. I want you to look at this. You're each going to have a slightly different response to this. Believe it or not, this is not in Michigan. This is in a less topographically challenged part of the world, but it is the United States. And I use this photograph both because it's iconic. I knew about it before I even thought about hydrology. It's by Ansel Adams, who went around and photographed the national parks as part of promoting the national parks. But now that you've had enough time to stare at it, what I want you to see is that there's incredible patterns here in this static image. But what I want you to think about for the rest of this talk, and whenever you see an image again like this, is what role does water play in connecting and controlling the aspects that you see in this photograph. So it connects the atmosphere through those clouds, through precipitation that you see on the hill slopes, and then that snow, the rain that falls on it, is going to move into the subsurface and travel down and feed the water that you see in that river. The flow of the water is also controlling the geomorphology, the landscape characteristics that you see, maybe those terraces or the shape of that river. But on the biology side, it's also controlling the movement of materials, solutes. It's also controlling the successional stages that you see there on that meander bar of the different plant species. But it's also connecting this wildland landscape, this beautiful part of the world, to our urban and economic centers, right? So I want you to be thinking forevermore about how water connects the things that you have an interest in or the things that you wonder about. So keep that in mind. That's my main take-home message. Water connects us all. That's profound. That's beautiful. It's a common language if we understand it and appreciate it. So that's what we do in our lab group. We've heard a lot of biology-based talks in the past, and so I thought I'd say water is our study organism, if you will. It's our way to make connections to other things that the world cares about. And water represents interfaces between multiple disciplines. And sometimes this feels tremendously overwhelming. If you study water, you can go in any direction because water is a part of everything. So we've worked on socio-technological water resources, talking about protecting endangered species that are important to people of New Zealand, water quality issues across Europe, most recently in France, coastal protection, river corridor restoration. We heard some about river corridor restoration for the importance of fish species that we care about. Today I'll take you to the climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems. And then a lot of our work is on the building blocks of life, trying to understand how carbon and nutrients move throughout the environment by really understanding the physics of water. So these are the three intersections I'll get to introduce you to a little bit today. But also how we approach water, because I am a hydrologist, meaning I study both the physics and the movement of water, but I apply that to understanding ecosystems. And so we have a mantra, simple message that I like everybody that graduates from my group to really understand is that the physics sets the limits and the biology gets it done, right? Being in an Earth Environmental Science department, I think on not just millennial timescales, not just centuries, et cetera, I think millions of years, right? Those physical processes have laid the template for present day life. And biology plays a tremendous role in that, but also biology has to exist on that physical template. So we draw on methods that have to do with both hydrology, biogeochemistry, and ecology. So we pull theory in from all of those. And our particular place that we spend a lot of time in is standing in rivers. And we use these streams and these rivers as sensors to talk about these bigger Earth system processes or even very local water quality issues. So let me introduce you now to maybe the perspective of our group and how I'd like you to think about rivers forevermore. So assessing the world from the perspective of stream water, and this is a picture, this is the first picture from the Arctic here of one of our favorite streams, is what is the water telling you as it flows past you? So if you're standing in that stream, what can it tell you? What stories does it have to tell? And where and how can you sense those stories, all right? And so that's the first thing I want you to understand is that rivers are not just what you see. Humans tend to be biased by what we can see easily, and that's the surface, and it's hard for us to see the subsurface. So the whole below ground part of the earth around us is in many ways connected to these streams. And if you're a hydrologist like me, you'll see and understand how water moves across the landscape and into that channel, both above ground flows and below ground flows to that stream. So some famous quotes, or at least quotes I appreciated, that rivers are really just expressions of groundwater. That's absolutely the case here in Michigan. There's many pathways to each stream, and each pathway is unique. And most importantly, perhaps from a sustainability perspective, is that we really appreciate that we all live downstream from somebody else, all right? And that matters. So streams also change materials. This is incredibly important to think about. They're not very simple. They're complex ecosystems, and they convert the water and the material that moves into them from land through above and below ground processes. And this is really where I get a lot of my inspiration, is because ecologists, sometimes I like to say, and this is kind of building off of a popular Academy Award winning film recently, is ecologists kind of try to study everything, everywhere, all at once, right? They see all that complexity and yet still try to move forward and make understanding. And so by understanding hydrology really well, I'm actually able to demystify some of those connections. And we can think about how streams are these big integrators. And Aldo Leopold is one of the founding pioneers of the field of ecology. And he articulated this quite nicely, is that the tortuous path of an atom during its downstream journey, that's really where much of the mystery lies in nature. And of course, I did a sabbatical where I worked with a lot of philosophers and had to broaden my horizons, and this is one of my favorite things. So here's the take-home message for you. Streams are simply not pipes. We model them, we teach them as pipes. They are anything but that, because now you know they're connected and they're transforming things. So ceci n'est pas un pipe, right? This is a philosophical statement to say that this is not a pipe. So We have another philosopher, and I expect many of you might have young people in your lives over the last few years, and there's profound wisdom coming from a new philosopher on the scene. Maybe you've seen him, maybe you've heard about him. He so profoundly stated that water has memory, okay? So because of the pathways that that water takes and how it integrates across landscapes and ecosystems into the river, it really does have memory. It has stories to tell. So that's what I'd like you, if nothing else, to think about, geeking out about is what does that water have to tell you in the future? So let me give you a couple now stories from that perspective. First about the Arctic, and introduce you to this place that most people never get to visit in their lifetime or know anything about, but many are arguing now controls the fate of the planetary climate cycle. And then I'll try to end up with some how we tell stories better. So first, here we go. Here's the first picture of the Arctic landscape, and this is an amazing place, all right? This photograph I took out of an airplane window flying south from the Arctic Ocean after finishing a field expedition on my way back to Fairbanks. And anybody want to know when I took this picture? I'll give you a clue, which isn't going to help any of you, but it helps me. It was on my birthday. I'm a Virgo. All right, August 29th, okay? And this wasn't the first snowstorm to come in August, all right? So this is a vast landscape. There's also, you can see there's no people there, and that this photograph really helps. I love it because the water hasn't frozen yet, and the snow really makes all that water on that landscape pop out, whether there's lakes and rivers and other things. So some quick facts about the Arctic. Aside from there are no trees, that's a very popular question. There's no trees, and we can talk about more why that is. But this landscape is massive, all right? So about 25% of the northern hemisphere exists in these cold landscapes. Above the Arctic Circle is much of it, and there's this permafrost. Now this is where ground is seasonally frozen for more than 2 years consecutively. All right, so this is ground frozen, and much of that permafrost has been frozen for millennia, tens of thousands of years. And in it are lots of interesting things. But at a global scale, we care about because there's massive amounts of carbon stored in it. About 2 times the amount of carbon is stored in that permafrost than is currently circulating in the atmosphere today. About 30% of the global organic carbon is stored in those permafrost soils. And interestingly, that part of the world in the Arctic is warming 2 to 6 times faster than the global planetary mean. So a place defined by frozen ground, ice, long cold winters is warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. In this map you see here on the right, that purple area is where that permafrost is located. So you can see it's all throughout North America, parts of Greenland, and Asia. So it's a circumpolar phenomenon. So with that warming, there is changing seasonality, and nutrient fluxes from land to water are expected to change. So here's another picture of an Arctic landscape from the middle of the summer. It's a green, verdant place. Again, no trees. And it's just expansive. And it's enormous. And draining those landscapes are rivers, as you can see here in this darkened part of the section. That's a river network. So these rivers here are sentinels of change, and that's what we use them because they connect that material, as you now know, from land to rivers and ultimately to the ocean. But this is a very remote location. It's very hard to study. Some incredible work has been done studying the largest rivers that drain this Arctic environment in the northern hemisphere into the Arctic Ocean. These are rivers on the scale of the Mississippi River in terms of their flows. These are big. And when we study the discharge, the amount of water that's flowing out of them per unit time over decades, we have very limited data, but we have pretty good records. These results show you here that there's not a clear pattern over the last 50 or 60 years that discharge is going up or down systematically with this warming. It's highly variable. But when we look at what's dissolved and moving in that water, there are systematic increases. In almost every material in solute that we measure, whether it's a geogenic material or biological material, we are seeing increases in the concentrations and the overall flux going out of these rivers. So this leads to the big question, so what are the mechanisms? What's causing this landscape to shed so much mass, so much material out through its rivers? And there's a lot of tremendous minds working on this, and there's lots of different hypotheses. This graph I don't have time to talk about all of it, but some of it is, yeah, it's warming. So what we call the active layer, that part that seasonally thaws, that soil is getting thicker and deeper each year, so maybe more materials coming out of that. Thermal karst, this is a term that basically means the ground thaws and rapidly collapses and a bunch of material moves off a hill slope into a river and out to the ocean. Shrubification, this has to do with warming, deeper soils, longer growing seasons, plants start to win out over the elements and larger stature plants can grow. And then there's also increased microbial processing because more of the environment's not frozen, so more microbes can diversify and move throughout a larger environment to process materials. So what are the blind spots in this Arctic research? And there are many. So we synthesize Arctic research to see what scales are these studies being done. Remember, this is a remote location, so there's a lot of logistical limitations. A lot of stuff's done at the scale of about the size of this platform I'm standing on today, a plot scale. Measure everything inside of it and then try to extrapolate to an area that's 24% of the landmass of the Northern Hemisphere. Or we stand at those massive rivers or use satellites and make measurements over tens of thousands of square kilometers. So there's this gap in the scale that we study these things, and river networks operate in those, can telescope at smaller or larger. So one of the big ensemble modeling efforts of what role does the Arctic play in global carbon balances shows us that we don't have all the information we need. So these are different results from the different models that have parameterization for Arctic systems to talk about petagrams of carbon storage change over the next few hundred years. And basically, if you look at the orange and green curves, that means the Arctic's actually storing more carbon. And the red, the dark green, and the blue curves, the ones that go into the minus values there on the y-axis, they're releasing amount of carbon. So what fate is the Arctic going to have? Is it going to be actually a net carbon sink over the next few hundred years, or is it going to be a massive source that might lead to a runaway kind of global warming scenario? So these Earth system models are awesome, but they're poorly parameterized for the Arctic. So we use streams as distributed sensors to inform both the small-scale ecosystem studies, but also these Earth system models. So this watershed unit, again, we're all sitting in a watershed today. We are in the Red Cedar watershed. We can, anywhere you go on this planet, you are inside of a watershed, okay? And so these can scale to smaller and larger sizes, and we try to use these then to look at sort of a representative amount of the landscape and the signal that gets integrated to it. And in this case, we're looking at basically tens to thousands of square kilometers to kind of bridge that gap I showed you in the current literature. So what are our tools? So how do we read the stories of these rivers? The first one I'll show you is technology that we have adopted and deployed in the Arctic to read the pulse of these watersheds. So what do I mean by the pulse? Well, the best analogy I can have is that you put a sensor into a point in the landscape and you measure high frequency measurements of maybe the flow of water, what's in the water, the chemistry of the water, et cetera. This is much like taking the pulse, right? It's very diagnostic. You put your hand, you can take the pulse. Your smartwatch maybe is doing that for you right now. And hopefully your pulse rate's going up because you're excited about this talk. It tells you about the system behavior, okay? But taking the pulse doesn't necessarily tell you where in your body or what specific process is leading to a change in your pulse or your behavior. But it's really useful. So here's some of the technology we use. This is working with an Austrian team to develop in situ spectrophotometers that basically have to be Arctic proof, and that means bear proof, and that means ice proof, and that means a whole lot of proof. Because the Arctic environment is harsh. And we deploy these, and we can take measurements every minute if you want, every 15 minutes. And here's some just quick results to show you. This is the flow of water in that top plot. We can get every 15 minutes, and then the dissolved organic carbon, right? So one of the master variables is ecosystems. And quickly you can see when the water goes up, the dissolved organic carbon goes up, all right? And so if we're only going out there doing more traditional method of maybe once or twice a year getting one measurement of discharge and one measurement of carbon, we really don't have any idea on how to like close a carbon budget for this landscape because we miss all of those peaks and all those big fluxes of material. The new approach that we've deployed over about the last 5-6 years now is not complicated, but completely different in that we want to understand the landscape, not just by measuring the pulse of it, but also where where can we do diagnostics to figure out where that signal is produced? So this is like an MRI or a CAT scan of your body. It's a snapshot in time, but it actually can help you understand in a very diagnostic way where the pattern or process of interest you care about is generated. So this is what we do across the Arctic landscape to try and figure out and test those different hypotheses I mentioned about like what could be controlling this big flux out to the Arctic oceans. We can repeat these snapshots just like we do for medical reasons and continue to do diagnostic follow-ups and take a bigger, broader picture of the landscape. Okay, so now that's some of the method stuff that we do, but how does it really get done? It's the people. It's the people at MSU. It's the students at MSU. It's the students and the colleagues from our collaborating institutions. This is big team science. I'll show you there's a wide variety of acceptable field gear in the Arctic. But there's one thing for modes of transportation that really only work effectively in the Arctic, and that's high boots and helicopters. So we get to fly around in helicopters a lot. Nice perk of the job for most of us. Not always a perk if you don't like flying around in small tin boxes. And we work across a wide range of landscapes because we are, again, trying to parameterize these Earth system models. We need to characterize different conditions. We can't homogenize the whole landscape. All right, so we work in Arctic system, alpine systems. We work in these wet acidic tundra systems. We work in places where there's lakes, where there isn't lakes. So we've published now like literally dozens of papers on this work because it really is the frontier of science. Pretty much every measurement we make is unique and novel. And so it's really exciting. And so these key results may not sound profound to you, but they are. And so when we do this kind of high frequency measurements and these spatial measurements, don't worry about interpreting the figure here. I'll explain that in a minute. But landscape really matters. If there's lakes in the Arctic that we're studying, then lakes really control the biogeochemical fluxes that move through rivers. If you're in an alpine watershed with low productivity, like it's not very green, it's mostly brown and looks like rock, that also really controls things. But if you're out in a more homogeneous landscape, then maybe we can use simplified models. All right. Probably the most juicy and exciting scientific result that we have so far is that we've discovered a representativeness issue, okay? And these measurements aren't just telling us about how the world works, but also informs how we're gonna do the next generation of science. And so now looking at this plot over here, you can see I've circled a bunch of data points. And those data points that I've circled all come from one particular part of a watershed, a little subcatchment, where pretty much I won't say what funding agencies, but let's say global funding agencies have invested the most amount of money per square meter. So there's tremendous amount of work there. It's a long-term ecological site. It's a lot going on there. But what you might see is in the spread of the other data around it, it's consistently an outlier in these fundamental building blocks of life. So we could talk about maybe in the question session why that might be. I don't know. But it's informing our future of the science. And also we've now generated these profound data sets that the Earth system modelers are very excited about because they're using downscaling products and can use our data. So using high frequency data, we can also reveal that there are hidden parts of the story of Arctic change. And this really, again, comes down to like human biases to study things when it's warm, it's sunny, we're not teaching classes, so we go up in the summer. And we really study this brief window of time when things are green and verdant and aren't really taking measurements outside of that window when much of the landscape is cold and dark. So we've got really great understanding how the world works sort of between June and August in the northern Arctic. But we don't know much anything outside of that. And so that's one of the big knowledge gaps. That's where these autonomous sensors that we developed and put out in the landscape are expanding our knowledge. And this is what we call shoulder seasons is really where climate change is being expressed the most. It's changing the seasonality. We've heard that for the Midwest. So goes the case in the Arctic. There's also the hydrology is changing a lot up there, right? The amount of water, simple physics will tell you the amount of water that can be in an area is temperature dependent in the air, okay? And so as the air warms, more water gets up there, you have more energy in the system, you get more chaotic, more episodic precipitation, and you also get snowmelt occurring earlier. So that dashed line I'm showing you is basically the pattern of the future, actually it's already here, of what these rivers are gonna look like. They're pulsing a lot more and the flow is shifting to earlier seasons. So we've done some of the first deployments that get out into those shoulder seasons and measured things that matter to global like carbon budget cycles. And what we're seeing in the rivers that we're looking at is that both the carbon and inorganic nitrogen that's coming out of these rivers, about 30% is coming out when we previously hadn't been looking. Right? So if we're doing mass balance modeling, we were misappropriating where that mass was going. It's actually going out through the rivers when we hadn't been looking. Okay, so enough on the Arctic. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if there's time. But now I want to talk about my journey more as a teacher and educator and working with water, and the fact that we need to tell better stories about water if we want to achieve more sustainable futures for society. So this hopefully will blow your mind. We live on a blue planet. Almost everybody assumes we have a tremendous amount of water that makes the life that we care about, our families that we care about, the economies that we care about go around. But that's all the water that's actually on this planet. And most of that is salt water. So when you'll see the next sphere pull out of this, this is the amount of total fresh water that exists on this planet. Right? Only 3.5% of the planet's water is fresh water, and this gets even more interesting. That teeny tiny little dot, if you have the proper prescription on, you will see it, that just fell out. That's 0.5% is actually accessible fresh water. And that amount is decreasing every year, primarily due to human activities, which have to do with polluting it, so it's no longer reusable. So I've shifted a lot of my effort to actually better educating just this basic principle. Fresh water is incredibly limited. It's a natural resource that everything depends on, and we need to think more about it. So we've been spending a lot of time in education outreach and trying to get people to appreciate water more. So now I have a little quick thought exercise for you. How much water goes into each one of the products you see here? A loaf of bread, the excellent model wearing this great 1-pound cotton t-shirt, a Tesla Model 3, or this cup of coffee. How much water did it take to produce each one of those? And this is clean fresh water. This isn't just salt water. We can't use that. All right, loaf of bread, 150 gallons. All right, most of this is, as Bruno sort of maybe you picked up, it has to do with the water that goes into the agriculture to produce that crop. It turns into bread. Cotton is another crop. It's water thirsty. Any guesses? About 2,000 gallons. Okay. Automobiles. They take water too, even though, right, we don't grow them, we make them. The average car takes about 30 to 100,000 gallons of water. And I put an EV up on here because everybody wants to talk about EVs these days. Yes, they do take more fresh water because of the battery production that goes into it. Coffee. We live and die by it, or at least I do. 37 gallons for each cup. All right? There's a lot of water that goes in the processing of coffee beans. So appreciate water. We need it, okay? We need it. Right? So don't just be curious about the water flowing through the environment, but appreciate it and value it. Most people don't ever learn about water, all right? And so, but where they do, right, if they had a good teacher or they're paying attention in class, is associated with this diagram, which is in almost every environmental science textbook published today. And this is what's known as the global water cycle, okay? And it's awesome because it's an Earth cycle. It talks about teleconnections, like how different vast parts of the world are connected. It also talks about conservation of mass principles, first principles, right? And I see these diagrams, I have to teach these things, and I get frustrated. I want to know, yeah, they're great, they're useful, but there's a lot missing from here, all right? If you had only were born and raised in Michigan, you would see this place and maybe understand what are these white-capped pointy things on the right side of the diagram, right? Or if I grew up in the southwestern United States, I also wouldn't recognize this. But I also wouldn't recognize it because what's missing that's covering most of this planet at this point, aside from the Arctic? Cities, people, crops, agriculture, humans, right? And their human footprint. And then also, what are we most uncertain about? We really just, these boxes and things have numbers on them, but there's huge amount of uncertainty in those. Now, the US Geological Survey, the United States, is the gold standard in terms of measuring, monitoring, and informing science at a federal level. And this goes across the world. The US has cut the funding, but they still are doing tremendous monitoring and data that's informing the world. This is their version of the water cycle. This looks like something out of the Pacific Northwest, right? This doesn't look like the rest of the world, all right? It's an awesome diagram, but it still has limitations. So this was a pet peeve of mine and some of the other people in my group. When we started this grassroots project, fueled primarily by undergrad students and other grad students in my lab, ultimately led by myself and a postdoc and some international researchers, to say, what part of the story are we not telling by having a bad or an incomplete diagram? So we analyzed diagrams from all around the world, over 450, translated them from all the different languages that they were discovered in, and said, what aren't we doing well in these? So on a more scientific level, we identified where the major knowledge gaps are in the global water cycle. So pretty much everything that has to do with groundwater is highly uncertain. Now groundwater, when I talked about that available water to humanity, it's almost all groundwater. We might be biased being in a Great Lakes state. We see all that water in the lakes. It's almost all globally, the water's in the groundwater. Also, everything high latitude, so those polar regions, is also very poorly known and constrained. And there's big misconceptions in this diagram, right? Only about 15% had any evidence of human activity. They all looked like pristine nature before humans showed up. And then in terms of ones that talked about anything that had to do with climate change, variability in places, or pollution, less than 2% of the diagrams had any of those processes included. So this was, it's not easy to make one of these. So we made one of these new diagrams. You can see this one here. It's more colorful, but it represents a lot more of the pools and fluxes. And it also includes like pink to show polluted water and other things. So we did our best and we got this work published, but we knew we could do better. So we worked with what's considered the world's experts on developing these diagrams. And that's the US Geological Survey, who also is green and white. So we had a great partnership. We agreed on what the colors should be. And so this is a really cool culmination of about a decade of frustration, thinking, working, is now the US Geological Survey member produces these diagrams, and they've just released their new diagram at the end of last year. So really exciting work. Happy to talk more about this. I can talk hours about it, the process that went into making this diagram with them. But this is the diagram that literally gets copied and used going forward. So we've rewritten how textbooks are going to be taught, all right? And that's pretty awesome. All right, so the other thing, I don't have time to talk about it, but we also are exploring how in the Anthropocene, all these different human factors, whether we're talking about global warming, land use conversion, or pollution, is creating compounding water crises around the world. And as you can see, each one of these boxes is a major water crisis that's unfolding, maybe not here in Michigan, but around the world, and is causing stress to sustainable goals. So there's so much work to do and so many stories to tell. I want to now tell you a bit about how we've really strived to tell better stories. So we need to improve our storytelling to achieve goals. So this isn't just literally going out in the field and training the next generation and doing great science, but we need to be better communicators. So first I want to show you, I empower my students to use the skills and the forms of communication that they are so awesome at, right? And that I kind of suck at. And that includes making short content videos. So I talked about that synoptic sampling.
Our team studies
They
reversed
produce 1-minute TikToks that the volume
sampling
just
anyways. Synoptic sampling gives us a snapshot of what's happening throughout a river system, which drains a portion of the landscape we call a watershed. To complete our synoptic sampling, we get in the helicopter and fly throughout the watershed. We stop at 40 to 50 sites in each watershed, collecting water samples and using a handheld sensor to collect data on water temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, and other parameters. Flying around these watersheds, we also get to see some pretty awesome sights, like grizzly bears, caribou, and even wolverines. We also see really cool landscape features like Aufeis, which is a buildup of ice from groundwater freezing in layers, and thermokarst, which are permafrost thaw slump features. Back at the lab, we filter all of the samples we collected. These samples are shipped in coolers back to our home universities to be analyzed for water chemistry parameters, including carbon, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, ions, metals, isotopes, and more. Thanks for watching.
So they conveyed information a lot better than I would, right? I mean, I'm getting better, but that's still great. And so they also put a lot of visual information and brought up a lot of terms that I haven't even had a chance to talk to you today about. It's really awesome. And this is very fulfilling to them and brings their science to a new dimension. So demystifying the science is really important. It's also really important to demystify the scientist. So science is hard and messy, and we tend to always show the end product. But this is really what goes into a lot of the work that we do. I will say that 24 hours of light does mess up your sleep patterns, and you get creative where you take naps. Told you, tall boots, they're important. It can be 80 degrees during the day and 20 degrees at night. Oops. We're only 40 miles from the nearest support. Notice I wasn't in any of those pictures. Yeah, so nobody wants to see me, but like those are the students, they're having their experience of a lifetime. They're seeing these places. Hopefully they'll come back and communicate this information to everybody they know, they care and love about. But also we're putting out this content which, might go viral, or at least I get to share with you today. And so that's really exciting. So we're trying to expand our horizons on how to communicate. In a more structured classroom setting, I wanted to say we're continuing to work on transferable and adaptable learning environments. COVID really pushed this to the next level. We already were doing in-class virtual visits and stuff, but this is a Google Classroom environment. If you had young children or grandchildren or nieces and stuff in class during COVID, you probably saw one of these when you're looking over the kid's shoulder on their device. So here's an interactive environment. This is about that hidden water idea, like understand how much water is in each of these products, watch a video that my group produced that helps you kind of go through the day and see your water consumption as you go through your everyday life, right? Because most people don't think about their water consumption. And actually, each one of you today, just by existing, maybe taking a shower, coffee, eating, you're easily knocking down 2,000 gallons of water to just live your everyday life here in the United States. So it's fun, and the kids love this stuff. We've also pushed our comfort zones in terms of talking about art, the interface of science and art. We had this great opportunity. MSU spearheaded this, led this. I thought it was tremendously successful and took a lot of the scientists, like the great researchers that we have at MSU, and also encouraged them to push their boundaries to translate their work to science. So here we don't have necessarily clear messages, but we're trying to evoke a response, get people curious, think about it. And this was really awesome. And tens of thousands of people cycle through these exhibits. And we use this exhibit now around the world. It's been in Europe, it's been at the MSU Museum on campus, and we get to use it in other science exhibits. Importantly, we've learned to listen better, not just to our science colleagues, underprivileged colleagues, but the audience. So being creative in how we collect information data about these stories that we're trying to tell. And so, I always thought, we did such a good job. People will be more curious and more empowered with knowledge. But what I want to emphasize is that all those dots that are on the right side of that plot are people who maybe they were just being anarchistic or whatever, but they said, I feel more disempowered knowing that there's so much water used in my life. Right? It is, right? It's kind of like climate change. It's overwhelming. I feel sad. There's nothing I can really do as an individual. So I wanted to leave now with a closing remark that basically says, it's not about the crisis. It's not about the fear. It's about the hope. You've heard today already there is so much to be hopeful for about feeding the future of the planet, more crop per drop, as Bruno would say. So the global water cycle, fresh water, it's extremely limited. It's extremely rare. It's extremely precious, and it's part of any sustainable future that we have on this planet. But it's cool in that it's a cycle. It means it's infinitely recyclable, right? If we don't screw it up, we don't pollute it. So there's a lot of hope in that. We already know what to do to preserve this water and do better using it. Clean Water Act is incredibly successful. all right? It's changed rivers that you could not fish in, swim in, including the red cedar, to make it a place that has an active fishery, and you can swim in it except within about 2 days after a rain event, because then you don't want to go in it still. But all around the Midwest, the Cuyahoga, right? We know rivers used to be on fire. The Cuyahoga you can fish in and you can swim in now. That's only about 50 years of time of that act being in place has been successful. We have solutions, they work, and then with water, they work quickly. Water connects us all. That's really powerful, right? We can all have a conversation about water in our everyday lives, whether we live on a lake or a river, drink a lot of coffee, right? So be curious. That way, awareness wakes curiosity, and you'll discover and think about water in your everyday lives. And I'd like to end, because we're all here connected to MSU, is being at a place like MSU, you're constantly given hope. There's incredible people, incredible resources, and discoveries happening every single day on this campus that are going to help us protect our water, find a sustainable future, and move forward. And that's just awesome. And that's why I'm here. You see it every day, you live it. So with acknowledgments, I want to end with a bit of letting you know a lot of people go into making this work possible, a lot of colleagues from many institutions and MSU. An army of students are trained through this work. And I've color-coded these students to say that because of water, they come from different disciplines, right? So we get a rainbow of disciplines represented, all focused on how do they use water to better understand the things that they care about. And this is represented in the funding agencies behind it. And with that, I will end with a group shot from the Arctic, where we're all so happy because we could finally all be together in the Arctic together because of no more COVID restrictions. So, thanks. And questions, I'm happy to answer. You could talk about what it's like to be in a helicopter. Bears, do the mosquitoes really suck as much as you think they do? Yes. So anything you want to ask, happy to talk about.
We do have an online question, which probably would warrant a whole nother day of conversation, but are there things in our everyday life that will help cut down on water usage?
You didn't just ask me that. No, there's so much we can do. I mean, there's small things that we can do, like improving the water infrastructure and stuff around us, but those really are a drop in the bucket. Making informed choices about the food that you eat, right? If you eat less meat, you consume a lot less water, and you also consume a lot less nutrients and pollution that go into producing that meat. That's probably one of the most powerful things that you can do. That helps carbon cycles, water pollution, and the overall usage of water. So changing diet, making diet choices, eating meat one less day, huge change. Saves thousands of gallons if you cut a steak out of your life. Education, being curious, and obviously voting for people who think that water matters and should be protected. If we talk about the Clean Water Act, it's constantly litigated. One of the profound things that blows my mind is I hopefully convinced you that rivers are expressions of groundwater. Groundwater is not protected in the Clean Water Act. So I could literally pour pollution into the ground here, and the river could be here. And I have to legally prove that there's a nexus between those two. Every one of us knows common sense that it is true. So there was a court case a couple of years ago that in Hawaii proved that, yes, if we can prove that there's a nexus, and that takes dozens of scientists and tens of thousands of dollars to do it, the Clean Water Act does protect things that you inject in the groundwater. But then we just had a court case last year which said that anything that isn't directly connected through surface water is no longer protected under the Clean Water Act. So yeah, that was bad. So it removed about 50% of the landscape from protection in the United States. 50% of what had prior protection has been estimated to be lost from protection. So I'd say those are the two top things, big bang for your buck. Think about informed votes and maybe eat a little less meat.